think we'll get started, everybody. So welcome everyone to the second episode of the People and Culture series, which is centered on the topic customer centricity, making change happen. My name's Mark Hamill. I'm the CEO of Architect Global, and thank you so much for being part of this today. I think we've got people from over 20 countries dialing in, which is fantastic. And just to give you a very brief background of what our company does, we're delighted to be working with people such as Diane and Ian, and particularly in customer experience, but a range of services which really helps companies improve. And just a bit of housekeeping as well. We're going to keep everyone on mute up until the Q&A at the end of the session. And I'm just going to pass it over to our two great speakers that we have today, two people I've worked with for many years now, Mr. Ian Golding and Diane Magers. So Diane, ladies first, I'll hand it over to you to get things started.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. I'm excited about this topic. I have been in this space for a long time, worked mostly in the B2B space, big complex organizations, and also was CEO for the Customer Experience Professionals Association for 3 years, and have had the pleasure to meet and help mentor and advise many brands across the globe. And I'm excited to be here with Ian Golding, who he and I have worked together for a long time. I won't even say how many years it's been. Ian, you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much, Diane. Yeah, I'm actually at least 20 years older than Diane, but I've aged far worse than Diane has. Like Diane, we have both been in this field for a long time. Me as a practitioner initially, then as a consultant. In fact, I celebrated my 10th anniversary as an independent consultant this year. And as a result, both Diane and I have got a very interesting insight into the way organizations are adopting an approach, not just to customer experience, but employee experience and customer centricity in general around the world. And I always like to think that we are sort of the yin and yang of customer experience, Diane and I. We're like a brother and sister in a way. So I do hope that you don't feel as though you're infiltrating a conversation between two siblings, because that might be what it sounds like at times.
We'll keep it interesting, right, Ian?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I think to leap right in, I know I can just talk a little bit about my own scars. I wish the topic of change management would have come much earlier in my career. I was doing change management, so to speak, by default and trying to put things together, but I wasn't very systematic around it. And part of that opportunity was really trying to define Ian, this chance of, when we say customer centricity, what does that really mean? Yeah. And what are the things that organizations can do to begin to think through? What is it? What do I need to do about it?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a question, Diane, which I didn't tell you I was going to ask you a question. Can you remember when you first heard the term customer centricity? Not customer experience, but customer centricity.
It was probably from Michael Lowenstein. This is way back when we worked to do paper surveys. That's how long I've been in this and sending them out. And he used the term, and I asked him what he meant by that. And one of the things that he said, how can I identify that? How do I really understand, what does that mean? What do I look for if I'm looking for an organization to be customer centric? And so that really began my questioning around, what am I really asking people to do differently? Right? Because he said it was all about kind of the behaviors of the organization.
Yeah. I agree with that. Now this is going to sound very sad, but then there are many people whose names I recognize, and it's lovely to see names I recognize, know that I'm quite sad when it comes to this subject. I remember the specific year that I first heard the term, and it was 1998 that I first heard the term customer centricity when I worked at GE. So it was in my induction at my first GE business, General Electric, for those of you that don't know, that I was first told that the most important thing to GE is customer centricity. And I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about at that point, because the first time I've ever heard it. And that the facilitator of the session drew a circle on a flip chart and said, that's where the customer is. And I did think it was, I don't know, a little bit insincere at the time, but what's fascinating is that I don't think I then heard the term again, probably until the mid-noughties. So I went to lots of other organizations, but no one mentioned that. So it's interesting that organizations like GE, even back in the 90s, did understand the significance of it. Whether or not they did that is a different matter. But I think it's interesting for all of us to reflect on, when did we first hear it, but do people really know what it means?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's the definition of, back to the point of, you think about the term customer centricity, it means putting the customer in the center of what you do. Well, what does that mean for each individual in the organization? So one of the things that we want to talk about, Ian, I think, is everybody's challenged with, we need people to be thinking and doing things differently, but that seems really overwhelming.
Yes.
Really overwhelming, because it's every person every day doing things differently, when we're all in this kind of assembly line, right? When we go to work, we do the same thing. We're very internally getting our work done. How do we instill that? What have you seen work really well?
So I think what's always fascinating about a conversation related to the subject of customer centricity is that, as we know, there is a confusion between the experience itself and what it means to be a customer-centric organization, because they're not the same thing. And yes, we've seen a huge surge of organizations over the last 15 years talking about the experience, but do they really understand what's required for that experience to be delivered and improved to ultimately result in a financial return? That's a different matter, because fundamentally, whilst organizations ramble on about the experience, it's not being delivered in the right environment, a cultural environment that enables people to do what's necessary to genuinely become customer-led. Now, part of the problem comes back to what you've just said, is that what ultimately is required is a change of thinking, a change of behavior, a complete change of mindset. Now, we know, because we've been around long enough, that people don't like change. They think they like change, but they don't like change. And businesses in all sectors, all industries globally, become so comfortable in the reality of today that change is just too difficult. And so they don't do it. And because they don't do it, they either then get to a point where suddenly everything starts burning and the platform starts to erupt and what are we going to do? And we start to react. Or they just willingly carry on as they are, hoping that everything will work out all right in the end. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think what I always say to people is that customer experience itself is all about facilitating sustainable growth. But I still don't believe that business leaders recognize how becoming customer-centric and delivering an experience in that environment can unlock sustainable growth. Sorry, I know I'm rambling now, but you know, I think this is just the fundamentals of everything that we do, but those fundamentals just aren't there.
Well, you know, change starts with the why. I've always believed that we have to be able to describe to people, we want you to be more experience centric. And they're like, that's great. I'm happy to do that. I believe in that. I understand what I think it means. But what do you want me to do differently? What exactly is it? And why should I change my behavior? What is it going to do for me? Like, think about it. It's all of what's in it for me. What's in it for me? How will it change the way I work? Is everybody else going to be doing the same thing? So these questions we have to really anticipate and really think about, to your point, the why of helping people understand, you know, it's for the good of the brand, that their business results come out of that. But people say, yeah, but I've already got all these other metrics and things I need to do, and I need to work toward those. So it's the installation, I think, of helping them to understand and then connecting each person to what they specifically can learn, do, build their skill set in order to make that happen. So we've got to make it relative.
The word I would add, Diane, to what you've said is it's got to become proactive.
Mhm.
You know, the world is almost entirely reactive. There are very few proactive organizations around the world right now. And over the last 2 years, increasingly, I've found myself thinking, why were no businesses prepared for a catastrophic event to happen? No one was prepared for it. You know, ultimately the pandemic hit and everyone panicked, you know, and had to react really quickly to sustain their businesses. Why? Why were they not prepared? You know, again, in the 90s, I worked in businesses that had a function called business continuity. There was a plan, business continuity. It was a big thing. What happened to that? Where's it gone? You know, why are we not thinking forward? Far too often, I think we've sort of created this legacy of retrospective thinking. Everything's backwards, but nothing's forwards. But the frustration is that these things have existed in the past, but they've disappeared. And I want to show you something. I've mentioned this to you before, and some of you may have heard me mention this. I do talk a lot about my GE days. Now, I can see that Greg is on the call, and Greg and I have had chats about my background at GE. It sounds quite extreme, but working in the Jack Welch era genuinely had an effect on molding me into the person I am today. And there were so many things that GE did in the 80s and 90s that we should still be doing now, but we don't. It's almost like, you know, no, we don't need to do that anymore. It's like it's a huge sort of wave of complacency. And one of the things that I was taught in the early days, and I have it here, okay, this is, you probably can't see this on the camera, but it's called a CAP kit. Okay, now I keep all of these things, and this thing is just wonderful. CAP stands for the change acceleration process. Okay, and the change acceleration process was a model for driving change. And I can't show it to you on the screen because regrettably, this shows how old I am, Diane. I don't have this electronically. Okay, I've only got this in a physical paper form. But the CAP model is all about understanding how to lead change and then ultimately determine how to change the systems and structures of an organization as a result. But it all starts with creating a shared need. This is not revolutionary, you know, it's been there. But why don't businesses use this stuff anymore? Is it because this is, you know, it's all a bit too structured and it's a bit too disciplined, and it's not utilizing brilliant tools like this that align everyone in the same direction, that means we continue to be reactive, subjective, judgmental, we shoot from the hip, we make gut feel decisions, and a lot of the time those things don't work.
And I think we'll talk a lot about the structure that's needed to put things in place to allow people to change. I always, whenever anybody says, you know, what would you do differently in this project next time? When you do a retrospection on a project, everybody says, we should have really started with change management. We should have done a better job at change management. It happens all the time. But that's a muscle that organizations have to build. And I think to your point of having a process, having the tools, having the structure and workflows and checklists, the things that we all rely on in our reactive world, to your point,
yes.
How do we make those part of what we do? And then how do we make it more proactive so it becomes embedded in the way that we work? And I think that's the biggest key.
But we mustn't underestimate that what we're describing, as we always say, is blindingly obvious. But I think to a degree, the way many organizations have developed their people or not developed their people, organizational environments and cultures haven't nurtured that. So I'm working with a business at the moment where the CEO is saying, I'm empowering you, do what you think is right. But they can't do it because it doesn't matter how many times the CEO says it, they still don't believe it. Really? Are you sure? No, I need permission. You know, and we mustn't underestimate, actually, it doesn't, even if you say it, people still won't necessarily know how to do it. because they've never done it and it's uncomfortable doing it. And I think we've also largely lived in a world over the last 20 years where that there are far too few leaders who we would describe as level 5 leaders, truly transformational leaders who actually want you to challenge them, want you to come up with new ideas and new ways. And so people are just sitting, waiting to be given direction. And that's, again, one of the root causes behind this reactivity rather than proactivity, because I'm not allowed to think of a different way. We'll wait for the board to tell us what we're doing, you know, and it doesn't come, you know, and then everyone gets frustrated and irritated and annoyed, and, you know, but why can't we change that? You know, we can change that if we want to, but that's easy for me to say. But, you know, but I have done it. I've done it myself, but it takes a level of confidence, a level of just sheer bloody mindedness to make that happen.
I think, yeah, I agree with you. It's a combination of changed leadership and that the why and the demonstrating what to do differently, but also those change management components, those tools and techniques that we use. It's a combination of those two things that have to be in place to do that. Yeah. And it takes, it's bravery. Right? It's bravery. It's being able to step out of where you are and say, I'm gonna do something differently. And encouraging people to do that, because nobody's going to do the things outside unless they see someone else do it, or they have the tools to say, good, you gave me something I can see in black and white that I feel comfortable with, right? And then getting them to gradually, is kind of like putting people on a bike with training wheels, right? You kind of give them, try this out, and once they get a little confidence, then you see that. And then to do things like identifying the leaders. So, you know, you all know in your organizations, you know who those people are that everybody else watches, that everybody else listens to, that everybody else goes to. You need to harness that power and give those individuals the ways of how to work, give them the tools, give them the resources, help them with the why, make them kind of your champions, your advocates, the people who can demonstrate how that works so that people have someone to follow. Because not everybody's going to be a leader to do this. They're not going to take the initiative, to your point. They're psychologically, they're just scared to make that change. They're scared for their job. They're scared it'll be
interesting, Diane. As you know, I still support people to get their CCXP accreditation. And a lot of people say to me, why is project management one of the competencies that a CX professional should have in their armory? And, you know, there are a number of reasons why, but one of the reasons is that project management actually contains many of the disciplines that are required to deliver change effectively. You know, and the basic fundamentals of project management don't just have to be applied to deliver change to a specific project, but they can be applied to deliver change to anything. And project managers are incredibly disciplined at understanding who the stakeholders are, developing an influencing strategy. That these are all things that, you know, what we mustn't do is be put off by leaders who have what I call a traditional leadership mindset, which this is going to sound very rude because there are lots of leaders who are not like this, but very short attention span. They don't really want to see lots of detail. You know, just tell me what the answer is going to be. They don't want to know what all of the structure is behind it, but you know, they have to understand that, because you know we've come from I suppose a century, the last century, where growth largely was delivered by just doing more. You know, you just needed to build more shops. You just needed to create more, you know, more channels to market. The more you did, the more business you generated. You know, the pharmaceutical industry, the more reps we've got on the road, the more sales we'll get. We're now in a century where more doesn't mean you're going to make more money anymore. You know, what you've got to now be is much smarter. Understanding how best to interact with the customer, which might actually be far less interaction that you've ever had before, but that might mean doing it completely differently. But I think we're at this interesting crossroads of a legacy of leadership that comes from the old school, and a new wave of leadership that actually isn't sort of handcuffed by the way businesses are supposed to work. And this is where the disruptors come in, and they don't do things like that. They do it wildly differently. But I think that the dilemma here is, we know that disruptors in the marketplace, they are the ones that come in with an intentional culture that does empower people to innovate, to be entrepreneurial. I think the challenge that we need to figure out how to overcome are the legacy businesses, because legacy businesses they're not changing. They are not changing at anywhere near the rate that they need to. And I think that they are still in the majority, but will it change as some of the old guard move on and retire and new people come up? I don't know, but that might be one thing that we need to see.
I believe that imperative of trying to bring more of that humanness back in, that how do we really work differently, not the old organizational models we're talking about, has been brought about by the great realignment, I'm going to call it. People resigned. That was just a symptom. It was people really trying to find their place of what's going to fulfill my needs. Where am I going to feel valued? What organization aligns with what I want? And so organizations now have had to look at their own organization internally to say, how are we supporting these employees? If we're going to keep our talent, what do we need to do differently? And so there has been a push, and a lot published recently around this. If you go and read anything now, you're seeing anthropologists and psychologists and neuroscience coming into play to support the change organizations, because they're having to be much more human than they had to before. Even if they were a creative, innovative organization, it's what more can we do? How can we continue to move that forward?
But because again, I always fear that I sound like the negative side of the conversation, but the but is, what that's translated into is to a much greater rhetoric around the importance of employee experience. But we've been working on the discipline of CX for the last 11 years, formalizing it. Employee experience isn't even recognized as a discipline yet. So, we're in a bit of a dichotomy at the moment, because customer experience is still in the early stage of evolution, and businesses are still grappling with what it really means and the competencies that sit behind it. Employee experience has now risen its head, and people like that, oh, that's really good. But there isn't a defined way at all of doing employee experience. And so there's even more confusion as to what that means. Many HR functions, they won't necessarily openly say it, but to them, it's the recruitment process, which, well, that's only one part of it, and so I think, ultimately, we have so much more work still to do. But I do think that the CX profession needs to find a way of not just talking about culture as a competency within a customer experience framework, but we now need to find a way of making that balance between the employee and the customer much more tangible. And I, for the last 12 months, have been referencing the human experience far more. And I keep using this expression that customer experience is all about human to human interaction, which it is. It always has been, and it always will be. Whether humans are using technology to do that is a different matter. But fundamentally, it's still about human to human interaction. And, I think unless businesses get their head around that, they won't create the cultural environment to enable that to become a reality.
And that language is really important. One of the things, I was just working with a really large nonprofit, and one of the things that we talked about was being clear about the terms you're using. So they didn't want to use customer centricity because they felt like that was kind of dissing the employees a little bit. And so we settled on experience led, because part of what they wanted to do is say, if we let experience lead, we're going to do things differently. So being experience customer centric is, yes, thinking about that customer when you start to put that at the center of your organization, but really looking outside and saying, how are we really pulling the organization towards something. What are we going toward? Where is the world going, so to speak, with experience? Because the next thing I think it's going to happen is, and you've already seen this, if you haven't noticed it already, is that now brands have to work together around the experience.
Yeah.
These chains of how brands, if you order your groceries from the store, or your refrigerator orders groceries from the store, then you got the delivery person, those brands have to work together, and they have to create an experience around all of that whole journey that crosses those brands. So we're going to see only more of it come into light of how it happens within and externally in the organization.
And Diane, I think you make a really important point, because in those scenarios where a business is reliant on others to fulfill the experience, that collaboration has always been vital, and it's still vital. But that same principle is within an organization as well. And, as we know, a term that is still mentioned on a daily basis is organizational silos. Organizational silos have always existed. They continue to exist. Businesses find it almost impossible to break them down. I think what, again, people are underestimating coming out of the pandemic is that those silos and the gaps between them are even bigger. And they're even bigger because people working within those organizational silos haven't met each other over the last 2 years. They've seen each other through the screen potentially, so they might know who each other are, but they're not even having the side conversations that they used to have. So that they may have had a friendship, or they may have been a fellow smoker with someone in a different function. So there were sort of connections that were informally bringing people together. That's now gone entirely. And over the last 3 weeks, it's the first time I've started to do things back again face to face. It is just wonderful seeing that coming back again. And yes, it's incredibly fortunate we've been able to interact virtually during this period, but actually that it's done some damage at the same time, because it's made that interconnectivity of people more disconnected. And we need to try and find a way of reconnecting people again so that they do work together. They do understand that we can't consistently deliver change, let alone experiences, unless we're doing it together.
Yeah. And I do see in many of the conversations with organizations who are trying to be experience led or maturing their practices, what we're seeing is really more of this, I would say, organizational design, right? So I'm not an organizational design psychologist. I'm clinical psychologist, more human. But what I see is those same conversations that we saw early on when entrepreneurship really began to turn off, when the innovation during the .com, all those, you think about the phases of journeys. What that means is the same nonprofit we talked about has now changed their organization so that 80% of their employees' time is spent in their silo. In other words, doing the core work. Yeah. And 20% is dedicated to these cross-functional learning, engagement activities that they know are critical to have cross-functional teams, so that it takes away that barrier of, hey, I can't go be a part of this, or I'm only going to give you a couple hours of my time because I'm not incented or paid to do that work. So we're seeing some really big shifts in how organizations are structuring even the way they work. And so you talk about change management, of giving people permission, all those things you talked about that are barriers to these changes. It's, sometimes it gets really core to who you are as an organization and how you work. How you work and why.
And actually, you stimulate another thought in my mind that, again, it's only in the last 2 weeks I found myself talking to clients and businesses about this. But it's something that has been very important from the beginning of time, but businesses just aren't thinking about it. We've been very focused on customer-centric transformation, moving from being sales-led and product-led to customer-led. And as a result, there's a lot of work that goes into the creation and development of the customer journey, the design of the customer journey, and the strategy that supports it. But we very, very rarely go to the next layer, which I call the process layer. And having determined what the journey looks like today and what we want the journey to look like, how many organizations then look at their organizational design and determine whether or not they need to redesign processes and the functions that deliver those processes to better enable that journey? You know, that there is a term that some consultants will use of a target operating model, which is a very consultancy term, but very, very rare for a CEO to recognize, do you know what, we've got to reorganize, because the way our business was built is no longer fit for purpose. It takes a hugely courageous leader to recognize that and make that happen.
It's ironic because I was just talking to a client about this, they said, we want to do a journey map. And I'm like, why? Why do you want to do a journey map? They said, well, we just need to understand the journey. I'm like, that's great, because what you're going to end up with is a bunch of projects, things that you've identified that are opportunities. But if you're not willing to do the other half of the work, which is service design. Now, service design is not just about services, for those of you who may not be familiar with that term. It is looking at all the things that it takes to deliver an experience. And whether that's a workflow, a process, a system, a piece of data, all those things have to be understood and threaded up to that experience. So we know what to change, because you can say, hey, they have a pain point here and you can go solve it. But if you don't understand all that depth of the roots, I call it, think about a tree, right? It's what's in the roots that you really have to change in order to make sure that tree blooms. So I see many organizations not doing the rest of the work when it comes to service design, and really making sure. And that's where they stand back and go, our data is not all in one place, or we have 5 knowledge management systems. Like, there's just these odd things you discover when you do that. And so I think that's going to be our next, truly, when you think about change, that's how you bring the people along who are typically, I don't face the customer, I don't have to do anything differently.
That's right.
No, you do. Everything you do every day, you make the decisions you make, how you put that data together, all thread to that customer. That's right. And I think that the other unique thing around what we do, if you think about our role as experienced professionals, I don't even say customer, just experienced professionals, is who else in the organization gets to have that end-to-end, top-to-bottom view and help the organization pull it together. Right? That's so rare, and that's really what organizations need. But there's nobody in the organization who does that. No. So that's why we also think that, like, digital transformations, now we see this kind of step back, take a look, do it right. People went out and just got it done because the pandemic came, but they didn't start with the experience and the change behind, here's the experience we're trying to create. What are all the things it's going to take to do that? And really design the digital experience first. And then that's
Diane, because the motivation was wrong. You know, the motivation was driven largely by cost than anything else. But, you know, I think you and I have often said, why is this not happening? And I think it's largely down to the fact that it's not easy. You know, it's hard. And that there is a word that anyone that hears me speaking for the next few months will hear me say this every time, a word that I am intensely despising right now. And the word is stretched. Every business I meet tells me we're stretched, you know, which basically means we are overworking our people. There is too much to do, and we are becoming so task focused that we have not possibly got the time to think about anything else. You know, which essentially means that they will never have the ability or the capacity or the capability to change. And for me, this is a massive problem, because the only way they can change is to give their people the time to be able to do it. And, you know, I think for all of the reasons that we've been describing, again, things that I was talking about in the 90s need to resurface. You know, we need to start thinking about what are people doing that is not adding any value. You know, I did value flow analyses in the 90s. We need to do it again. You know, we have introduced so much, excuse the expression, crap into what people do every day. Over time, it needs a spring clean. You know, people just need to stop and just say, hang on a second, what do we actually need? And at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things I loved is that the pandemic was like a bureaucracy buster. You know, because in the first 2 months, everyone was in such a state of shock that all of the unnecessary meetings, reporting, stuff, it all stopped, because we've got to focus on making sure we're doing the right thing to keep the business alive. All of that crap's come back again. You know, if we didn't need it then, why do we need it now?
Yeah.
You know, we need to stop all of the stuff that is not necessary and give our people space, time to be creative, be innovative, to truly be able to think about what's best for the customer. But
Yeah.
again, it comes back to the word we used already. It takes courage to do that.
Yeah,
You know?
and change and intention, I think. So one of the things we wanted to share with the group is a little bit of an approach to kind of change in human growth and the things that we've been talking about here. So I'm going to share just a few slides and kind of talk you through them. And I'm hoping that this kind of shift of how you approach the things we've been talking about will be evident. And there's also a couple of tools in here. So I want to just show you some of the, you think about the black and white and how do I go do some of these things. I want to show you a little bit of that and give you a concept that I think might help with some of the change. So we're going to do that. And then we're going to get to these questions as I see them popping up, which is great. So keep them coming on chat. Kazina and I will address those. I'll just go through a few of these concepts and we're happy to share these resources if you'll just connect with Mark and Richard at the end. Give me just 1 second. And we're going to get to this. So one of the things that we talked about was this difference between really change management and change leadership. So when you think about change management, this is about the set of kind of tools and structures to guide change efforts. So this is a skill set, a competency, whatever you want to call it, to actually manage the change itself. Been around a long time, obviously, hasn't really shifted a lot until recently. Because what we're seeing is now that change leadership is becoming much more important. And this is the ability for us to really take that and make sure that we're responsible for that transformation, to define and direct an organization to those new destinations. So rather than it just being the toolkit, we're really looking at who is going to lead that, and to our conversation earlier, who is going to show that leadership, show those behaviors, talk about it, and champion how people can take those risks and be brave that we just talked about. So if you think about this, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is this is a change leadership assessment. And it's a little bit about, do we have an articulated change? Who's accountable? Are the benefits of the change clear? So we just wanted to give you a little bit of where are you on this change leadership from a clarity, commitment, and capabilities. A lot of this, when you go back to capabilities model, which we've seen come up a lot more in organizations recently, is are we really mature in the places we need to be mature when it comes to capability standpoint? So that's one of the tools that we wanted to share today. And you think about this at the very beginning, we talked about change is highly emotionally charged. No question that change is hard because people have all of this angst or excitement or whatever emotion it is. And so our ability to really understand that's important. And why we think about that is if you really think about the way change is occurring in organizations, it's not any different than designing any experience. We have to be intentional about it. And so thinking about the change by design is what I want you to walk away with. That change is really a design project. You are talking about the human, you are looking at where the opportunities are, how people need to change, what their needs and expectations are, and then putting a plan in place to really design, understand, prototype, listen. It's the same process. So if we treat change as a design project, it really helps to put some structure around it, rather than it being where are all the tools and what do I use when. So by creating change collaboratively, as design is all about, to Ian's point about inspiration, we involve everybody from the beginning. So they're helping to design the change. And this was key to a transformation in a large financial company that we did, is that we had change events, which were just part of where they wanted to occur and how people could be involved in the change and influence it. Because guess what? They're more accountable to the change if they influence and contribute to it. So when we think about what we want them to do, then we create those conditions for them to buy in and participate. by doing it in a design way. So using design frameworks and experiments early on, we kind of get these shifts, these small things become bigger because we have the momentum of the people who are in the sessions designing the change itself to really go out and champion it, to understand the why, to communicate it. So we're really building that swell, if you will, of information and the way the organization's approaching it. But if we think about viewing that change as a design project, we are going to define what the change will look and feel like. So this is the biggest scary part of change, is that people don't understand, well, I don't see where we're headed. I don't understand what that's going to do for us. And I don't know what to feel about that. I might be excited, but I'm also anxious about it. How do we know that? And how do we design for those? So change is the experience and should be designed. That's the whole point behind what I've been saying. It can add a lot to the strategy and process of change management. So if you think about using all those tools and resources and put it in the context of design, then we're going to be able to go support that change leadership and have everybody involved. Personal, purposeful, intentional, engaging. Those are key guiding principles behind design. It's the same with change. So here's an example of a design technique. When you think about to-be or future state storyboarding. So this is a little bit about what's the future look like and what's it going to feel like in the future and what are we able to do differently. So this technique is just changing the perspective from I'm in my day-to-day and I'm looking for that next thing I have to do. And when we really change our perspective and think about, well, what are we trying to skate toward? What is that going to look like? And creating that, not just the vision, but the how we're going to get there and that pathway, it helps people understand, hey, like if I'm going to go take a trip, I want to plan it out, know where I'm going, know where I'm going to stay. It's no different with this change. And so having an example of that to help individuals really think about, here's what I do today, here's what I'm going to do tomorrow, and what's the size of that impact. So really thinking through those things. And this is an example of 4 of them, but there are many more you could put in here. But just the shift, just describing that shift and where we're headed toward with a group and trying to really think about the future and what's going to happen helps people to see that and engage and understand it, which is half the battle. So really thinking about the to-be journey. When we do these to-be storyboards, we have people draw pictures. It's engaging people with what that future actually looks like for themselves, for the organization, for their teams. So if we think about design, we think about all the things it can do for us. And what I want you to think about is that we're really trying to get to those measurable outcomes of changes to experiences or changes to the brand. It's really about those perceptions that people have. Those are based on changing the ways of working and the skill sets. And it's then the thinking. So a lot of times when I see these big posters about, here's how we're going to do, here's our guiding principles, people are looking for, I agree with that, I just don't know how to do it. The working and the skills is part of that. And then as they begin to work through it, like in this design approach, they start to change their perception of the change. And that then comes with those kind of hard outcomes that we're after. So we see it as kind of a little bit of the iceberg. We got to build it from the ground up a little bit so that what we do on the outside really shows. So change by design. I want you to be thinking about change as a change project and using terms like, what if we could? So part of this is, again, back to that language of how do we bring an organization along? We'll send you those 2 resources that we shared. And if you have additional questions, you can certainly connect with us over Will. Happy to have more conversations about it. And Rich, I'm going to turn it back over to you for some of the questions that are on there now that we've shared a little bit of the how.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Diane. And thank you in the wonderful conversation so far. And great questions coming through as well. So shall we start from the top? I think that's the best way to go, yeah?
Let's go. Of course.
Brilliant. So Melissa asked the question, which was quite early on in the conversation. What is the best way to measure that growth as you start to change the mindset? Is there anything that you would recommend? So
if Melissa is able to just clarify what she means by that growth, do you mean the growth of the business financially, or do you mean cultural measurement? I don't know if Melissa can still hear us.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi. Thanks so much for this talk. It's been really nice. I think at that time I was thinking more about the shift in the culture. That is my responsibility in my role, is to kind of lead the culture shift. And I'm finding it difficult to know, how to measure that. And Diane's last slide was nice in, changing those perceptions. But how do I know that what we're doing is working?
Okay. Let me give you, I'll give you a perspective, Melissa, and then I'm sure Diane will add her perspective as well. One way of doing it is what I describe as voice of the employee, because I feel that it's important to have an understanding of the alignment between customer perception and employee perception. Now, when I talk about voice of the employee in the context of customer experience, I'm not talking about employee engagement. What I mean is if VOC represents customer perception of an organization's ability to deliver the customer journey, VOE is exactly the same thing, but from the employee's perspective. So if you ask an employee, a customer, how likely are you to recommend our organization to someone else? What would happen if you asked the employee the exact same question? And the reason that this is a good indication of cultural stability, cultural mindset, is that what you're looking for is an alignment. The way your customers feel about the experience should not be radically different to the way your employees feel. Very often, what you'll find are the two extremes. A scenario where customer feedback tells you that the organization is great. But if you ask your employees the same question in the right way, very often they will give you a totally different answer and say, actually, no, we think the experience is terrible. It can go the other way around, where you can have a situation where your employees can tell you you're amazing, but actually your customers tell you a different story. That's usually reflective of an organization whose people are too far removed from the reality of knowing what it's like to really be a customer. Voice of the employee is a mechanism that enables you to really understand, are your people feeling the same as your customers? And the reason it's a useful mechanism to give you an indication of the cultural state of the organization is that VOE, in the way I'm describing, is aligned to VOC. So if you can improve the perception of your own people related to the customer experience, you should see a correlating effect on the perception of your customer. I'm only describing this at a very high level. So if you want to know more about what I mean, Melissa, just reach out to me offline. But Diane, I don't know if you want to add your perspective to this.
Yeah, I'm going to get really tactical. I see a lot of guiding principles. And one of the things that I ask when people say, I want my organization to change, or how do I measure it? I'm like, what are you expecting their behavior to be? If you want different behaviors, you want people to be doing things differently, I think you have to define that. So one of the things we ask organizations to do with their guiding principles is convert them to behaviors that are traceable, trackable, and measurable. An example of this would be one app dev team, said, we don't have anything to do with the customer. We get the guiding principles. We need to keep the customer's voice in at all times, be centric about it. But when they really thought about it, it was, we need to be involved in the research that's done with customers ahead of time, not just requirements thrown over the fence. We need to be able to write the requirements in customers' language. We need to be involved in any project that's going forward when the kickoff occurs and throughout the milestones. So they were able to then identify those. And so we put measures in place that said, how often did that happen? What was the outcome of it? So we could put looking at the organization and saying what behaviors are changed. I have a very precocious youngest child. And one of the things that she told me when she was about 4, and I said, you need to behave, when she was acting up. And she said, Mom, I don't know what you mean by that. Can you tell me exactly what I'm supposed to do differently? And I'm like, you know what? That's exactly right. I have not defined for you what behaviors I'm looking for. So leave it to a precocious 4-year-old to put me back in line. But that's one way. And then the second part of that is looking for behaviors and tactically making them, but also the obstacles and enablers. to those behaviors. What are the obstacles? My boss won't let me go be part of a cross-functional team. Obstacle. Enablers, I need to learn about design. If you want me to understand how to design things differently, teach me. So having that type of conversation, and I'm happy to share an exercise that does just that we've done with many organizations to get them to that point, Melissa. So hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ian. So we've got 2 questions left from the audience. We've got 9 minutes left. The next question, I think it's one of those ones we could talk about forever, but I'm going to read out this from Naima, which is, how would you tackle that change in an organization where, number 1, the top management are happy and thrive in a chaotic environment, and number 2, when there are employees who have been in the organization for too long and are completely resistant to change? Would laying off those employees be an option? It's part of number 2. So thriving in chaos and resistant to change. So bear in mind, 9 minutes left.
Yeah. Well, the last question I think we can answer relatively quickly, actually. So if I go first, Diane, again, I'm being very rude in going first, but I'll give you a rest for a moment. The first part of that question, Naima, I think it is essential that there is an understanding of the reality of what that looks like. Diane shared with you that change leadership assessment, which I think is a brilliant tool, actually. And any form of self-assessment that can allow leaders to understand the consequences of what they're doing is really useful. So what I'm suggesting to you to think about are 2 S's: structure and stories. What's really important is that when we feel that the environment isn't right, we don't try and create an emotive conversation that our opinion is different to theirs, because we'll just end up making the situation worse. This has to be, firstly, as fact-based as possible, and secondly, they've got to come to their own conclusion that actually they may need to do things differently. Getting them to assess the reality of where they are today is a brilliant way of doing it. And if you use a model like Diane's, and there are other models, you'll be surprised, actually. They'll come to the realization that, no, we're not doing these things. And actually, maybe that's actually important. The point about stories, what you need to gather are as many evidence-based stories as possible that really articulate the effect of operating in an environment like that. Stories both from the employee and from the customer themselves, to just really articulate that, you know, at the moment, this is dangerous for the organization. So make it as evidence-based as possible. Don't make it an emotional conversation. Diane, I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, there's plenty of these. I lead these stories sometimes with, it's a wonder I didn't get fired. But at AT&T, I worked in the business side of AT&T. And one of the things that I did with one of the kickoff sessions we were having with a large project that was one of the top drivers of customer dissatisfaction for one of the products. And I asked one of the executives to come to the meeting and be an active listener. Okay. He wasn't allowed to participate. He was coming just to listen. And everybody at the beginning was like, you know, oh my God, such and such is in the room. But eventually, as we got into the work, because we were doing design thinking and people were up at the wall and there was lots of side conversations, is the warts came out. It was all about how the organization wasn't working together. We didn't have the right data. This is in our way. What can we do here? Problem solving. You could hear the organization do that. And at the end of it, the story that executive walked away with is, we're not in touch. We're not in touch with what's really happening in our organization. So just getting him to be a part of that was eye-opening for him. And of course, he went back and shared that with the rest of the leadership. And so we began to invite them to the working sessions, and it became almost an expectation, because then they could start to hear, especially at kickoffs and milestones, what was going on in the organization that was going to be an obstacle, a success, where they saw the light bulbs go on. They could start to share stories with themselves. So it became a little bit of the culture for what we were trying to do.
And that second part of the question, Naima, sadly, it may well be the right option. Employees who have lost all enthusiasm and all love for their job, for the business, for the customer, I describe them as nosedivers, which is not a very nice expression. But the reality is, if they don't want to be there and they are having a negative effect on the mindset of others, then encouraging them to maybe either retire or find alternative employment may well be the right thing to do. The worst thing that an organization can possibly do, and I've seen it happen many times, is invest so much time trying to make those people happy that you forget about the employees who are giving you everything, and you don't invest enough in them. So don't pander to the nosediver. I think ultimately make sure that their voice is not negatively influencing others. And if that means either moving them to a job where they can't damage others or removing them from the organization altogether, it may well be the right thing to do.
Great. Okay, and we've got time for probably one last question, which is from Pascal, which is, Ian mentioned that CX professionals should have project management in their toolkit. Why not rather change management? And so, his example, Proshi.
Pascal, you're a bright chap. You are a bright chap, that's for sure. So some people are probably looking at that thinking, what on earth is Proshi Adkar? Proshi Adkar is now actually within the CCXP curriculum, actually. There is a question in the CCXP exam that references it. So what that basically means, Pascal, is that yes, we are expected to have a good working knowledge of project management, change management, and continuous improvement. So that is also why, as well as methods like Prosky, we're also expected to know Lean, to know Six Sigma, to have an understanding of Agile, of design thinking. You don't have to be experts in all of these things, but yes, you do need to have a working knowledge. So absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, I think we have run out of time, unfortunately. I think you could both go on forever, I'm sure, and I'm sure everyone would stay here to listen, but we promised to always try to keep the time. So a huge thank you, Diane and Ian, for today. Wonderful session. Thank you so much to everybody for contributing as well. Great questions coming through. And if you would like to get in touch with myself or Laura, who you've all been speaking to, please do so. Happy to introduce you to Ian and Diane. And if there's anything you would like to say, Ian or Diane, before we go?
What I would say is Anchor. I know Anchor's asked a question. If you want to reach out to me or Diane through LinkedIn, we'll respond to you that way, Anchor. So please do just message us and we'll respond to you.
Brilliant.
Thanks everyone for coming and sharing time with us today.
Absolutely. It's lovely to see so many people that we know and others that we don't know as well. And it's always lovely to share the stage with my big sister, Diane.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you, Mark and Richard.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.